Hi, and welcome to our video lesson on John Donne's poems and wit. This segment will be suitable for Year 12 Advanced students who have these texts set for study. So we're going to start by looking at the author, John Donne. Donne was born a Catholic at a time when Catholicism was illegal in England. Donne went to Cambridge University, but couldn't graduate because of his Catholicism. When his brother died in prison after harbouring a Catholic priest, Donne began to question his faith. Donne spent his inheritance on women, literature, and travel. He married Anne More against the wishes of her father. This ruined his career and earned him a stay in prison, and he was only released when the marriage was proven valid. But by this point the damage was done. In writing to his wife about losing his job, he said, "John Donne, Anne Donne, undone." Following his release from prison, Donne practiced law, which these days is considered quite a prosperous career, but in those days was something that only lowly people did. And he was in a constant state of financial insecurity with a growing family. Anne bore him 12 children in 16 years of marriage. Donne despaired that the death of a child would mean one less mouth to feed, but he couldn't afford to pay the funeral costs. So at this time it was obviously a dark place in his life, and he wrote but did not publish By a Thanatos, which was his defence of suicide. His wife died in childbirth, giving birth to their 12th child. Donne never remarried after this. This was considered highly unusual at the time, especially considering that he had a large family to bring up. So a lot of scholars will say that this is evidence that Donne truly loved his wife. Donne converted to the Church of England at the urging of King James I and became a preacher. So he'd written to James I asking for a position in his court, but James had denied him and said, "Look, I can't give you a position because you're known to be a Catholic, but if you convert, maybe we can do something about it." So he did convert and actually became a really popular preacher. His sermons were well known, and he wrote prayers on health, pain, and sickness before his death. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Donne's writing style. Donne's earliest poems show sharp satire of Elizabethan topics such as corruption, mediocre poets, and pompous courtiers. So some of his earlier poems also show a confident arrogance that his later poems lack. So that's things like The Sun Rising and The Apparition. Donne argued that one ought to carefully examine their individual beliefs rather than blindly following an established tradition. For none would be saved at the final judgment by claiming a Harry or a Martin taught them this. So this is the first inklings we have of Renaissance individualism when it comes to religion. Donne is famous for metaphysical poetry and is considered a master of what we call the metaphysical conceit, which is like an extreme sort of metaphor or extended metaphor that combines two vastly ideas into a single idea. This is usually used to explain something that's abstract, like love or dignity. So, for example, in A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, he compares two lovers who are separated to the legs of a compass. Donne's poetry also represents a shift from classical forms to more personal poetry. So poets in the olden days tended to act very much as though they were talking about an entire nation. So they would write about wars, big events, things that happened to heroes or kings, but not necessarily about their own personal life. And Donne's poetry is showing a bit of a change away from this to write about the personal. He is also noted for his poetic metre, and in this case we don't mean a metre is in 100 centimetres, we mean it in terms of the rhythm or rhyme that a poem has. So his poetic metre is structured with changing and jagged rhythms, so that rather than sounding sing-song, like a lot of other sonnets do, it sounds much more like casual speech. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the values in Donne's poems and how they relate to the influences of the Renaissance and of the Jacobean Era. The Jacobean Era is the fancy term for what we call the period in which King James I had the throne of England. So the first thing we're going to talk about is melancholy. James I inherited a lot of debt from Queen Elizabeth I, which saw England plunged into economic hardship. Coupled with a plague outbreak and the gunpowder plot, which had been an assassination attempt on James I's life, it's easy to see why the general public was depressed. Another value, mostly of the late Renaissance, was the thinkings and writings of Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, who experienced a revival in the Renaissance. Plato believed that somewhere out there in the universe there was one perfect example of everything. So, for instance, there was one perfect Platonic dog, and all other dogs were merely a shadow or emulation of this dog. In metaphysical poetry, this particular Platonic notion of seeing the world is expressed in the belief that the experience of love or beauty in one's partner was an echo of the one true beauty of God. Another thing to think about in the Renaissance were all of the new scientists that were coming forward. So we had navigation, cartography, and space revelations by people such as Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler. And these ideas were very exciting. It was all about, human discovery. And they captured metaphysical thinkers and served as sources for some of their more unusual conceits. For instance, the compass we were talking about earlier relates to the science of cartography. So now what we're going to do is read through Donne's poems and then look at some of the techniques in them. So we're going to start with one of his earlier poems. So you can kind of think of Donne in terms of early poems and late poems. The early poems have that young, confident, arrogant voice, and the later ones are a lot more sorrowful and a little bit more disparaging of himself. So we're going to start with The Sun Rising. Busy old fool, unruly sun, why dost thou thus through windows and through curtains call on us? Must to thy motions lovers' seasons run? Saucy pedantic wretch, go chide late schoolboys and sour apprentices. Go tell court huntsmen that the king will ride. Call country ants to harvest offices. Love all alike no season knows nor clime, nor hours, days, months, which are the rags of time. Thy beams so reverent and strong, why shouldst thou think I could eclipse and cloud them with a wink, but that I would not lose her sight so long? If her eyes have not blinded thine, look, and tomorrow late tell me, whether both the Indias of spice and mine be where thou left'st them, or lie here with me. As for those kings whom thou saw'st yesterday, and thou shalt hear, all here in one bed lay. She's all states, and all princes I, nothing else is. Princes do but play us compared to this, all honours mimic, all wealth alchemy. Thou, son, art half as happy as we, in that the world's contracted thus. Thine age asks ease, and since thy duties be to warm the world, that's done in warming us. Shine here to us, and thou art everywhere. This bed thy centre is, these walls thy sphere. So you can see in that you already have a couple of ideas about circular motion of the sun and the planets. So that also raises some of the Renaissance science values that we had earlier. So let's have a quick look through the techniques. So obviously the poem is an apostrophe to the personified sun. An apostrophe is when you talk to an abstract like nature and treat it as though it is a real person. The persona is characterized as a young, arrogant lover who uses imperatives to tell the sun to go away, since lovers are not bound by seasons or natural laws. He then uses rhetorical questions to mock the sun, claiming that he can lessen its power by winking, meaning that he can make it dark. He then falls into a blazon. So a blazon is a particularly common romantic technique in poetry, where when you're talking to a lover, you describe how fair her hair is, and her eyes, and her face, and her cheeks, and you break her up into little pieces so that you can praise each one separately. So he praises his lover's eyes and creates a metaphysical conceit where he contracts the whole world to his bedroom and says that she is the riches of India. He then ends the poem with a fond, though arrogant personification of the sun as an old man, whose job is now easy. Warming the lovers is the same as warming the whole world. So now we're going to go on and have a look at the poem The Apparition. When by thy scorn, O murderess, I am dead, and that thou think'st thee free from all solicitation from me, then shall my ghost come to thy bed, and thee, feigned vestal, in worse arms shall see, then thy sick taper will begin to wink, and he whose thou art then, being tired before, will, if thou stir or pinch to wake him, think thou call'st for more, and in false sleep will from thee shrink. And then, poor aspen wretch, neglected thou, bathed in cold quicksilver sweat, will lie, a verier ghost than I. What I will say, I will not tell thee now. Let that preserve thee, and since my love is spent, I'd rather thou shouldst painfully repent, than by my threatenings rest still innocent. So in this one we can see the persona is characterized as a bit of a melodramatic, venomous man addressing his ex-girlfriend, or perhaps not someone who's ever really loved him but who he just fancied. He uses sexual imagery such as sick taper, wink and shrink, describing his hauntings that will ruin her sex life with her new partner. He then makes historical allusion to the Vestal Virgins, who are a traditional and sacred person in ancient Rome, and he won't tell the recipient exactly what he's going to do in case she takes his goading as a warning and remains innocent sexually. This diction is particularly odd because it seems that he wants her to go out with another man just so that he has the opportunity to punish her, which is obviously fairly cruel. But this reflects the inconsistency of Petrarchan sonnets, where men value chastity but also desire premarital sex, and obviously you can't have both. So this kind of shows an inconsistency in the Renaissance men and their attitude to women. So this is one of the other younger poems, although we would expect at this point, the Relique, that John Donne has already met Anne and fallen in love. So I'll read the poem first. When my grave is broken up again, some second guest to entertain, for graves have learnt that womanhead to be to more than one a bed, and he that digs it spies a bracelet of bright hair around the bone. Will he not let us alone, and think that there a loving couple lies, who thought that this device might be some way to make their souls at the last busy day meet at this grave and make a little stay? If this fall in a time or land where mass devotion doth command, that he digs us up will bring us to the bishop or the king to make us relics, then thou shalt be Mary Magdalene, and I a something else thereby. All women shall adore us, and some men, and since at such time miracles are sought, I would have that age by this paper taught what miracles we harmless lovers wrought. First we loved well and faithfully, yet knew not what we loved nor why. Difference of sex we never knew, no more than guardian angels do. Coming and going we perchance might kiss, but not between those meals. Our hands never touched the seals, which nature, injured by late law, sets free. These miracles we did, but now, alas, all measure and all language should I pass, should I tell what a miracle she was. So the tone of this poem is obviously a lot more romantic and loving, and begins with a long rhetorical question. He asks what a gravedigger from the future would think about his lover and he being buried together. Through biblical allusions, he decides that they will consider their bones holy objects because of their true love. And of course this goes back to that Platonic concept of true love being like an echo of God's love. So again, this is the idea that everything emulates the love of God, which we just covered. He also states a desire to publish their love by writing a poem. So the idea that he's self-consciously talking about a poem, even though he's writing it, is a self-consciousness of writing which first appeared in the Renaissance. Shakespeare does a lot of this in his sonnets too. And this sort of thinking about writing and the nature of what it will accomplish is supported by the hyperbole, all measure and all language should pass. So that's the end of this segment. We're going to move on to the next part of the lesson now and look at Death Be Not Proud.